Welcome to Vices and Volumes, the podcast that brings forgotten stories from the 1800s back to life. I'm Avril, and each episode I dive into my collection of old books, manuscripts and journals to uncover the fascinating tales, beliefs and characteristics that shaped our past. From forgotten ghost stories to social customs, from scientific curiosities to supernatural folklore. If it's tucked away in these pages of history, I'm going to find them and I'm going to share them with you. In this episode, we're diving into William Cobbett's 1829 advice to young men and incidentally young women, specifically his chapter on choosing a wife. Now, you might wonder what qualifies a 66-year-old man to dispense romantic advice, but Cobbett wasn't just any gentleman pontificating from his armchair. This was a man who'd been sued for libel multiple times, imprisoned for 2 years, exiled twice, and who once dug up Thomas Paine's bones and brought them to England for a heroic burial. That never happened. So clearly, we're dealing with someone who understood commitment, but not necessarily follow through. But what makes Cobbett's marriage advice quite sound is that he had been married to the same woman, Anne Reid, for 37 years by the time he wrote this book. Through poverty, multiple exiles, imprisonment, financial disasters, and enough scandals to fill a Netflix series, this is a man who lived what he preached, for better or for worse. In this episode, we'll explore his advice on choosing a wife through some of the most entertainingly bizarre tests imaginable. We'll learn how to judge a woman's character by watching her eat a mutton chop, while the speed of her footsteps reveals her capacity for love, his stern warnings about wives who dare to argue, and his surprisingly touching devotion to his own wife. William Cobbett's 1829 book, Advice to Young Men and Incidentally Young Women, was a modern and forward-thinking book that provides young men entering the world with guidance on how to become a good man throughout his life. For this episode, I specifically looked at the chapter on choosing a wife. Cobbett was born in 1763 to poor farmers in Surrey, England. His first job was standing in fields scaring birds away from crops. His start was not easy. He came from no money, no education, no prospects. But Cobbett was a fighter, clearly intelligent, and a man with great sense of justice. At 21, he joined the British Army, and while stationed in the frozen wilderness of New Brunswick, Canada, he taught himself English grammar by candlelight. This farm boy with no formal schooling became so skilled with words that his superior officers, who could barely write a sentence, became embarrassed to let him see their work. It was in Canada, in St. John, that 29-year-old Sergeant Major Cobbett met American-born Anne Reid. They married in February 1792 in Woolwich, England. This marriage would last through every challenge that William brought to the table. Within weeks of marrying, Cobbett tried to expose corruption among his officers and had to flee Britain to avoid arrest. He took his new bride to France in 1792, right in the middle of the French Revolution. They arrived just in time for the September massacres. Cobbett, horrified and possibly terrified, fled with Anne to America. So Anne's first year of marriage involved fleeing 2 countries. That's quite a start. In Philadelphia, Cobbett reinvented himself as Peter Porcupine, the most vicious political writer in America. He wrote pamphlets attacking Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and anyone who supported France or democracy. His pen was a weapon. When Dr. Benjamin Rush treated yellow fever patients with bloodletting, Cobbett dove in and called him the Samson of medicine, accusing him of slaying his thousands and tens of thousands. Rush sued for libel. Cobbett lost and had to pay the total sum of $8,000, the equivalent around $200,000 today, a devastating fortune. In 1800, rather than pay, Cobbett fled back to England with Anne and their young children, leaving his debts behind. Back in England, Cobbett started the Political Register, a newspaper he'd published from 1802, lasting for 33 years until his death. As a result of his work on the paper, this conservative loyalist gradually transformed into a radical reformer, a man who defended kings, now championed the poor, and attacked corruption so effectively that working-class people across England read his word aloud in taverns. In 1810, his criticism of military flogging landed him in Newgate prison for 2 years with a £1,000 fine. When he was released in 1812, 600 people attended a dinner in his honour. but he still came out financially ruined as a result of the fines and time served. By 1817, facing another arrest, Cobbett fled to America again, his third escape. This time Anne stayed behind in England with most of the children, while Cobbett took their two eldest sons to a farm on Long Island. For 2 years they lived separated by an ocean, but the marriage held. Anne managed the household in England, while Cobbett furiously wrote in America, sending money whenever he could. When he returned in 1819, he brought with him Thomas Paine's bones. Yes, really. Paine was an English-born American political activist, philosopher, and revolutionary who died in New York City on June 8, 1809. And Cobbett was planning a heroic burial. The bones, however, were never buried, and they were found amongst Cobbett's effects when he died 16 years later. Throughout all this, the exile, the imprisonment, the financial disasters, the scandals, Anne was there. Throughout the book, he holds himself and Anne as the model marriage. And honestly, given what the marriage survived, maybe he's earned that bragging right, and Anne a trophy. Let's see exactly what Cobbett did have to say on what one needed to look for when choosing the perfect wife. Before we get into Cobbett's famous list of 8 virtues to seek in a wife, I want to share some of his most entertainingly bizarre advice, his physical test for determining a woman's character. Because Cobbett genuinely believed you could judge whether a woman would make a good wife by observing how she walks, how she eats, and how she talks, similar to livestock. This is Georgian pseudoscience at its finest. Let me start with industry, one of the 8 essential virtues. The question is, how can you tell if a young woman is industrious or lazy? After all, she's probably on her best behaviour when you're courting her. Cobbett had a solution, and this involves watching her very, very carefully. But who is to tell whether a girl is to make an industrious woman? How is the purblind lover especially to be able to ascertain whether she, whose smiles and dimples and bewitching lips have half bereft him on his senses, how is he to be able to judge from anything that he sees, whether the beloved object be industrious or lazy? Why, it is very difficult. It is a matter that reason, or very little to do with, but there are, nevertheless, certain outward and visible signs from which a man, not only deprived of the use of his reason, may form a pretty accurate judgment also to this matter. That phrase, purblind lover, half blind with passion, acknowledges that romantic attraction clouds judgment. Yet Cobbett remains confident that careful observation will reveal character and physical details. This confidence was not unique to him. The early 19th century was fascinated with physiognomy, the idea that moral character could be read from physical features and behaviours. Johann Caspar Lavater's essays on physiognomy was popular throughout Europe, claiming you could judge someone's entire personality from the shape of their nose or the set of their jaw. Phrenology, reading character from skull bumps, wouldn't peak until the 1830s and 40s. But the underlying assumption was already widespread. Body and soul were intimately connected, and the inner person manifested in outward signs. Cobbett applies this popular belief to the specific question of choosing a wife, and he starts with a story. It was a story in Philadelphia some years ago that a young man who was courting one of 3 sisters happened to be on a visit to her when all 3 were present. And when one said to the others, "I wonder where our needle is," upon which he withdrew, as soon as he was consistent with the rules of politeness, resolved never to think more of a girl who possessed a needle only in partnership, and who, it appeared, was not too well informed as to the place where even that share was deposited. This was, to be sure, a very flagrant instance of the want of industry, for if the third part of the use of a needle satisfied her when single, it was reasonable to anticipate that marriage would banish that useful implement altogether. In reality, a respectable household would have had many needles. Sewing wasn't optional for women in 1829, it was essential. Women made and mended all the household linens, all the family's clothing, did all the repairs. Even wealthy women who could afford to buy ready-made items were expected to do fine needlework, embroidery, lacework, decorative sewing. The scenario Cobbett described would have struck his readers as shocking and amusing, not only just because it suggested laziness, but because it suggested a complete failure of proper female education. But Cobbett acknowledges that most females won't let you see such obvious signs. Such instances are seldom suffered to come into contact with the eyes and ears of the lover, the disguise of all defects of whom is the great business, not only on the girl herself, but her whole family. Everyone is on their best behaviour during courtship, so you need subtler tests. There are, however, certain outward signs which, if attended to with care, will serve as pretty sure guides. And first, if you find the tongue lazy, you may be nearly certain that the hands and feet are the same. By laziness of the tongue, I do not mean silence. I do not mean an absence of talk, for that is in most cases very good. But I mean a slow and soft utterance, a sort of sighing at the words instead of speaking them, a sort of letting the sounds fall out, as if the party were sick at the stomach. The pronunciation of an industrious person is generally quick, distinct, and the voice, if not strong, firm at least. Not masculine, as feminine as possible, not a croak or a bawl, but a quick, distinct, and sound voice. Nothing is more disgusting than what of the sensible country people call a maw-mouthed woman. A maw-mouthed man is bad enough. He is sure to be a lazy fellow, but a woman of this description, in addition to her laziness, soon becomes the most disgusting of mates. In this whole world, nothing is more hateful than a female's underjaw, lazily moving up and down and letting out a string of half-utterance sounds. It is impossible for any man who has any spirit in him to love such a woman for any length of time. Look a little also at the labours of the teeth, for these correspond with those of the other members of the body and with operations of the mind. Quick at meals, quick at work, is the saying as old as the hills in this, the most industrious nation upon earth. And never was there a truer saying. But fashion comes in here and decides that you shall not be quick at meals, that you shall sit and be carrying on the affair of eating for an hour or more. Good God, what I have not suffered on this account. However, though she must sit as long as the rest, and though she must join the performance, for it is a real performance, unto the end of the last scene she cannot make her teeth abandon their character. She may and must suffer the slice to linger on the plate, and must make the supply slow in order to fill up the time, but when she does bite, she cannot well disguise what nature has taught her to do. And you may be assured that if her jaws move in slow time, and if she rather squeeze than bite the food, if she so deal with it as to leave you in doubt as to whether she mean finally to admit or reject it, if she deal with it thus, set her down as being, in her very nature, incorrigibly lazy. Cobbett advises young men to take their potential wives out for a meal and observe their jaw movements. Firm, decisive biting indicates a good wife. Tentative squeezing indicates disaster. The mutton chop becomes a character assessment tool. His aside about fashionable dining reveals frustration. By the 1820s, fashionable dining among the middle and upper classes had become an elaborate, time-consuming ritual. Meals could last 2 or 3 hours with multiple courses served in succession, complex etiquette about which utensils to use, and an expectation that you would eat slowly and delicately, making polite conversation throughout. For someone who values efficiency and substance over style, this represented torture. He'd rather dispatch with the food quickly and move on to useful activity. This impatience with fashionable affectation runs through all his writing. He's a plain-spoken, practical man who considers most social rituals ridiculous time-wasting. After the mutton chop test, we moved to the walking test. Another mark of industry is a quick step and somewhat heavy tread, showing that the foot comes down with heavy goodwill, and if the body lean forward a little and the eyes keep steady in the same direction while the feet are going, so much the better, for these discover earnestness to arrive at the intended point. I do not like, and I never liked, your sauntering, soft-stepping girls who move as if they were perfectly indifferent as to the result. And as to the love part of the story, whoever expects ardent and lasting affection from one of these sauntering girls will, when too late, find his mistake. The character runs the same all the way through, and no man yet saw a sauntering girl who did not, when married, make a mawkish wife and a cold-hearted mother. The connection Cobbett draws between physical manner and emotional capacity reflects the conviction that the character runs the same all the way through. This kind of thinking that the outer manner directly reflects the inner character in a readable way was extremely common in the early 19th century. People believed that careful observation could reveal someone's moral worth. And in a world without extensive background checks and long courtships, many couples married after knowing each other for only a few months. Physical observation was one of the few tools available for judging character. There is something practical buried in here beneath the absurdity. Cobbett advocates observation of women in everyday situations rather than being dazzled by their best behaviour in formal courtship settings. Energy levels, purposefulness, and the ability to focus on tasks, these are qualities that might reasonably predict how someone will handle the demanding work of running a household and raising children in 1829 England, when they both required enormous physical labour and sustained attention. The conclusion to this section crystallises his approach. Never mind the pieces of needlework, the tambouring, the maps of the world made by her needle. Get to see her at work on a mutton chop, or a bit of bread and cheese, and if she deal quickly with these, you have a pretty good security for that activity. Forget the fancy needlework, the decorative accomplishments. Watch her eat some cheese. That's where the truth lies, according to Cobbett. He moves on to define what he means by the second most important quality in a wife. After chastity, sobriety. But he doesn't mean sobriety in the sense that we use it today. He's not primarily talking about drinking. He means something much broader and much stranger to modern ears. By the word sobriety in a young woman, I mean a great deal more than even a rigid absence from that love of drink, which I am not to suppose and which I do not believe to exist anything like generally amongst the young women of this country. I mean a great deal more than this. I mean sobriety of conduct. The word sober and its derivatives do not confine themselves to matters of drink. They express steadiness, seriousness, carefulness, scrupulous propriety of conduct, and they are thus used amongst country people in many parts of England. When a Somersetshire fellow makes too free with a girl, she reproves him with, "Come, be sober." And when we wish a team or anything to be moved on steadily with great care, we'll cry out to the carter or operator, "Soberly, soberly." Somersetshire example reveals how the world functioned in rural dialect. Be sober meant behave yourself. The word carried connotations of control, deliberation, proper conduct. This was a quality deeply rooted in working class values of steadiness and reliability. Cobbett continues with what he means for marriage. Now, this species of sobriety is a great qualification in the person you mean to make your wife. Skipping, capering, romping, rattling girls are very amusing when all costs and other consequences are out of the question, and they may become sober in the Somersetshire sense of the word. But while you have no certainty of this, you have a presumptive argument on the other side. To be sure, when girls are mere children, they are to play and romp like children. But when they arrive at that age which turns their thoughts towards the sort of connection which is to be theirs for life, when they begin to think of having command of a house, however small or poor, it is time for them to cast away the levity of the child. This abrupt transition from childhood playfulness to adult seriousness that Cobbett demands was typical of Georgian and early Victorian expectations. Young women were expected to transform themselves the moment marriage became a possibility, typically in their mid to late teens. This was no concept of an extended adolescence or gradual maturation. The burden that this placed on teenage girls to suddenly become sober in all of their conduct was considerable. But Cobbett argues that this quality is the foundation of his own success. This sobriety is a title to trustworthiness, and this, young man, is the treasure that you ought to prize far above all others. Miserable is the husband who, when he crosses the threshold of his house, carries with him doubts and fears and suspicions. I do not mean suspicions of the fidelity of his wife, but of her care, frugality, attention to his interests, and to the health and morals of his children. Miserable is the man who cannot leave all unlocked and who is not sure, quite certain, that all is safe as if grasped in his own hand. He is the happy husband who can go away at a moment's warning, leaving his house and his family with as little anxiety as he quits an inn. not more fearing to find on his return anything wrong, that he would fear a discontinuance of the rising and setting of the sun, as if in my case, leaving books and papers all lying about at sixes and sevens, finding them arranged in proper order and in the room during the lucky interval, freed from the effects of his and his ploughman's or gardener's dirty shoes. This was quite a different vision of femininity that the one becoming fashionable in the wealthier circles of 1829. The ideal of the delicate, decorative wife, the woman who played piano and did watercolours but didn't do much actual work, was increasingly popular among the aspiring middle classes. Cobbett has no patience for this whatsoever. He wants a woman who is fundamentally serious and useful, not ornamental. The emphasis on complete trustworthiness reflects the practical reality that wives had an enormous power in the day-to-day household management, even if they had no legal authority. For women without independent incomes, which was the vast majority, a successful marriage was essential to their survival and their children's survival. A successful marriage, in practical terms, meant one in which the household was managed efficiently, expenses were kept under control, and the husband was content enough not to gamble, drink, or philander away the family's resources. A sober wife, in Cobbett's sense, steady, serious, reliable, trustworthy, was indeed more likely to achieve this than a flighty, frivolous one. Whether this justifies the burden placed upon young women to abandon all levity is another question entirely. Cobbett is also absolutely adamant that a wife must obey their husband without question, and that any hint of female authority in a household must be crushed immediately. At the time when the book came out, relative to the late ill-treated Queen Caroline, I was talking upon the subject one day with a parson who had not read the book, but who, as was the fashion with all those who were looking up to the government, condemned the Queen unheard. Now, I said, be not so shamefully unjust, but get the book, read it, and then give your judgment. Indeed, said his wife, who was sitting by, but he shan't, pronouncing the words shan't with an emphasis and a voice tremendously masculine. Oh, said I, if he shan't, that's another matter. But if he shan't read, he shan't hear the evidence, he shan't be looked upon by me as a just judge, and I shan't regard him in future as having an opinion of his own in anything. All which the husband, the poor henpecked thing, heard without a word escaping his lips. The book refers to the published evidence in the attempted divorce proceedings against Queen Caroline in 1820. King George IV had tried to divorce his wife on the grounds of adultery, producing witnesses and evidence. The case became a massive political scandal, with radicals like Cobbett defending the Queen and conservatives supporting the King. Reading the evidence meant engaging with the scandalous material and taking a political position. The parson's wife, it seems, did not want her husband to take a position that might displease the government, or perhaps she simply didn't want him reading salacious material. Either way, her command, he shan't, represents for Cobbett an intolerable inversion of proper household order. Cobbett's strategy is revealing. He doesn't argue with her directly. Instead, he undermines her husband's authority by suggesting he'll never take the man's opinions seriously again. And the poor parson sits there in silence. A husband thus under command is the most contemptible of God's creatures. Nobody can place a reliance on him for anything. Whether in the capacity of an employer or employed, you are never sure of him. No bargain is firm, no engagement sacred with such a man. Feeble as a reed before the boisterous she-commander, he is bold in injustice towards those whom it pleases her caprice to mark out for his vengeance. In the eyes of neighbours, for friends, he is such a man cannot have. In the eyes of servants, in the eyes of even beggars at his door, such a man is a mean, despicable creature, though he may roll in wealth and possess great talents into the bargain. Such a man has, in fact, no property. He has nothing he can rightly call his own. A beggarly dependent under his own roof, and if he have anything of the man left in him, and if there be a rope or river nearby, the sooner he betakes him to one or the other, the better. The melodrama here, suggesting a henpecked husband would be better off drowning himself, reveals how deeply Cobbett believed that the male authority in the household was essential, not just to the order, but to the masculine identity itself. A man like Cobbett needed his wife desperately for domestic management, for emotional support, for the whole structure of his life. but he also needed to believe that he was in charge. The tension between the dependence and authority runs through the whole text. What is fascinating as well, though, is his acknowledgement of female solidarity. Women are a sisterhood. They make common cause in behalf of the sex, and indeed, this is natural enough when we consider the vast power that the law gives us over them. The law is for us, and they combine wherever they can to mitigate its effects. This is perfectly natural and, to a certain extent, laudable, evincing fellow fleeing and public spirit. But when carried to the length of he shan't, it is despotism on the one side and slavery on the other. This acknowledgement was unusual for 1829. Most conduct books simply insisted on male authority without acknowledging the legal framework that made female resistance necessary. Georgian law gave husbands complete control over their wives' property, earnings, children, and even their bodies. Married women had no legal identity separate from their husbands. Husbands retained the ultimate authority over all major decisions. It is a division that probably worked reasonably well in many marriages, especially ones where there was mutual affection and trust. But it required the wife to accept a fundamentally subordinate legal and social position, regardless of her personal capabilities. The one exception he gives is interesting. Nevertheless, in some of these concerns, wives should be heard a great deal of attention, especially in the affairs of choosing your male acquaintances and friends and associates. Women are more quick-sighted than men. They are less disposed to confide in persons upon a first acquaintance. They are more suspicious as to motives. They are less likely to be deceived by professions and protestations. They watch words with a more scrutinizing ear and look with a keener eye, and making due allowance for their prejudices in particular cases, their opinions and remonstrances with regard to matters of this sort ought not to be set at naught without great deliberation. Women's supposed superior judgment of character was a common theme in conduct literature of the period. It was one of the few areas where female intelligence was acknowledged and even celebrated. The contradiction is striking. Cobbett insists on absolute male authority while simultaneously granting that women are better judges of character than men. He can serve his wife, but she cannot command him. He consult her judgment, but his will must ultimately prevail. The tension reveals much about masculinity in an era when men's legal authority was absolute, but their practical dependence on women was enormous. Now, having given all this advice about industry, sobriety, and obedience, Cobbett proceeds to prove that his system works by telling the story of his own courtship and marriage, and by showing exactly what kind of husband he became. It's quite charming. It's one of the most charming love stories in English literature that I've seen. When I first saw my wife, she was 13 years old, and I, within about a month, 21. She was the daughter of a sergeant of artillery, and I was the sergeant major of a regiment of foot, both stationed in forts near the city of St. John in the province of New Brunswick. I sat in the same room with her for about an hour in company with others and made up my mind that she was the very girl for me. That I thought her beauty is certain, for that I always said should be an indispensable qualification, but I saw in her what I deemed marks of sobriety of conduct, which I have said so much, and which has been by far the greatest blessing of my life. It was now the dead of winter, and of course the snow several feet deep in the ground and the weather piercing cold. It was my habit when I had done my morning's writing to go out at the break of day to take a walk on a hill at the foot of which our barracks lay. In about 3 mornings after I had seen her, I had, by an invitation to breakfast with me, got up 2 young men to join me in my walk, and on our road lay by the house her father and her mother. It was hardly light, but she was out in the snow scrubbing out a washtub. This was the girl for me, I said when I got out of hearing. He arranged his morning walk specifically to pass by her house. He admits this quite openly. He saw her marks of sobriety of conduct. She was out working hard in the freezing snow. This tells us everything about what Cobbett valued: industry, dedication, the willingness to do the necessary work regardless of the conditions. At the end of about 6 months, my regiment, and I along with it, were removed to Fredericton, a distance of 100 miles up the river of St. John. And, which was worse, the artillery were expected to go off to England a year or 2 before our regiment. The artillery went, and she along with them, and now it was that I acted part becoming a real and sensible lover. I was aware that, when she got to that gay place, Woolwich, the house of her father and mother, necessarily visited by numerous persons and not the most select, would become unpleasant to her, and I did not like, besides, that she could continue to work hard. I had saved 150 guineas in the earnings of my early hours in writing for the paymaster, the quartermaster, and others. In addition to the savings of my own pay, I sent her all my money before she sailed, and I wrote her to beg of her, if she found her home uncomfortable, to hire a lodging with respectable people, and at any rate not to separate the money by any means, but to buy herself good clothes and to live without hard work until I arrived in England. And I, in order to introduce her to lay out the money, told her that I should get plenty more before I came home. 150 guineas was roughly £22,000 in today's money, an enormous sum for a sergeant's daughter. Cobbett sent all his savings to her and told her to spend it on lodgings if her home was uncomfortable, good clothes, living comfortably without hard work. He was trying to protect her and improve her circumstances while they were separated. But then came the delay and the extraordinary reunion. As the malignity of the devil would have it, we were kept abroad 2 years longer than our time. Mr. Pitt, England not being so tame then as she is now, having knocked up a dust with Spain about Nootka Sound. Oh, how I curse Nootka Sound! And the poor bawling Pitt too, I'm afraid. At the end of 4 years, however, home I came, landed in Portsmouth and got my discharge from the army with the greatest kindness of poor Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who was then the major of my regiment. I found my little girl a servant of all work, and hard work it was at £5 a year, in the house of Captain Brissac, and without hardly saying a word about the matter, she put into my hands the whole of my 150 guineas unbroken. 4 years, she was 14 to 18 years old during this wait. She had 150 guineas, a fortune. She was living in Woolwich, a garrison town, full of handsome officers and good-looking soldiers. Instead, she took work as a servant, earning £5 a year. Back-breaking work, the lowest position in a household, and saved every penny while she waited. When Cobbett finally came home, she handed him the entire sum untouched. Anne Reid demonstrated every quality Cobbett values: sobriety of conduct, industry, frugality, and above all, trustworthiness. But Cobbett doesn't just tell us about Anne's virtue. He shows us what kind of a husband he became, and this is where the contradiction between his demands for obedience and actual behaviour becomes most apparent. I began my young marriage days in and near Philadelphia. At one of those times to which I have just alluded, in the middle of the burning hot month of July, I was greatly afraid of fatal consequences to my wife for want of sleep, she not having, after the great danger was over, had any sleep for more than 48 hours. All great cities in hot countries are, I believe, full of dogs, and they, in the very hot weather, keeping up during the night, a horrible barking and fighting and howling. Upon the particular occasion to which I am adverting, they made a noise so terrible and so unremitted that it was next to impossible that even a person in full health and free from pain should obtain a minute's sleep. I was, about 9 in the evening, sitting in bed. "I do think," said she, "that I could go to sleep now if it were not for the dogs." Down the stairs I went, and out I sailed in my shirt and trousers, and without shoes and stockings, and going to a heap of stones lying beside the road, set to work upon the dogs, going backward and forward, keeping them at 200 or 300 yards distance from the house. I walked thus the whole night, barefoot, lest the noise of my shoes might possibly reach her ears, and I remember that the bricks of the causeway were, even in the night, so hot as to be disagreeable to my feet. My exertions produced the desired effect. A sleep of several hours was in the consequence, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, off went I to a day's business. The detail about going barefoot so his footsteps wouldn't wake her is particularly striking. The consideration extends to every small detail that might affect her comfort when it comes to his daily routine. I had business to occupy the whole of my time, Sundays and weekdays, except sleeping hours, but I used to make time to assist her in taking care of her baby, and in all sorts of things. Get up, light the fire, boil her tea kettle, carry up a warm water in cold weather, take the child while she dressed herself and got the breakfast ready, and then breakfast, get her water and wood for the day, and dress myself neatly and sally forth to my business. The moment that was over, I used to hasten back to her again, and I no more thought of spending a moment away from her, unless business compelled me. The thunder and lightning are tremendous in America, compared to what they are in England. My wife was, at one time, very much afraid of thunder and lightning, as is the feeling of such women, and indeed all men too. She wanted company, and particularly her husband in those times of danger. I knew well, of course, that my presence would not diminish the danger, but be what it might, if within reach of home I used to quit my business and hasten to her, the moment I perceived thunderstorms approaching. Scores of miles I have, first at last, and run this errand, in the streets of Philadelphia. The assumption that husbands should help with domestic tasks would have been very unusual, but Cobbett sees no shame in it whatsoever. This was radical advice for 1829, when men's social lives centred on all male spaces, and it was perfectly normal for husbands to spend most evenings away from home. Cobbett argues that presence, being at home, being reliable, is the foundation of a successful marriage, and who could argue with him? He also tells the story of importance of reliability. Going from London to Botley once with Mr. Finnerty, whose name I can never pronounce without an expression of my regard for his memory. We stopped at Alton to dine with a friend who, delighted with Finnerty's talk, as everybody else was, kept us till 10 or 11 o'clock, and was proceeding to the other bottle when I put in my protest, saying, "We must go, my wife will be frightened." "Bold man," said Finnerty, "you do not mean to go home tonight?" I told him I did, and then sent my son, who was with us, to order out the post-chaise. We had 23 miles to go, during which we debated the question whether Mrs. Cobbett would be up to receive us, I contending for the affirmative, and he for the negative. She was up, and had a nice fire us to sit down at. She had not committed the matter to a servant. Her servants and her children were all in bed, and she was up to perform the duty of receiving her husband and his friend. "You did not expect him," said Finnerty. "To be sure I did," said she. "He never disappointed me in his life." Now, if all you young men knew how much value women set upon this species of fidelity, there would be fewer unhappy couples than there are. If men have appointments with lords, they would never dream of breaking them, and I can assure them that their wives are as sensitive in this respect as lords. Men wouldn't dream of breaking an appointment with a nobleman, but to think of disappointing their wives because they assume that the women's feelings don't matter as much, Cobbett argues this is a profound mistake. So what are we to make of William Cobbett's advice on choosing a wife and being a husband? It's a fascinating tale of contradictions. This man who insists that wives must obey their husbands without question, but who spent his evenings helping with the baby and his nights walking barefoot through the streets to protect his wife's sleep. A man who demands that women be serious, sober, and industrious, but who has clearly delighted in his wife's company and rushed home to be with her at every moment he could. A man who was a radical reformer in politics, championing the poor, attacking corruption, and demanding universal suffrage, but who accepted without question that men should have an absolute authority in their households. These contradictions tell us something important about gender and power in Georgian England. The law gave men complete authority over their wives, but the practical reality of daily life was that men depended on women for domestic management, emotional support, childcare, and the whole structure of a comfortable existence. A man like Cobbett needed Anne desperately, far more perhaps than she needed him, but he couldn't acknowledge this dependence without feeling emasculated. So he insisted on his authority while simultaneously demonstrating his devotion. He would serve her, but he would not obey her. But what makes Cobbett's advice still readable today is that underneath all this period-specific attitudes about wifely obedience and female sobriety, there are some timeless insights about marriage. Marry someone you actually like and whose company you enjoy. Choose someone whose character you trust completely. Show your love through actions more than words. Take care of each other in sickness and in health. Make home a place you want to be rather than a place you escape from. These aren't revolutionary insights, but Cobbett lived them with unusual dedication. He and Anne survived extraordinary hardships together. We don't have Anne's account of their marriage, we only have William's version, told with the obvious pride and probably some selective memory. Did she really never complain about the exiles and imprisonments? Did she feel as happy and fulfilled as William claimed she did? We'll never know. But we do know that she stayed with him for 37 years, raised 6 children, managed a household of multiple countries and varying degrees of chaos, and apparently remained devoted throughout. Whether that makes her a model wife or simply an extraordinarily patient and capable woman is for each reader to decide. Until next time, may you find a partner who bites their mutton chop decisively. May you never have to spend 8 hours barefoot throwing stones at dogs to prove your devotion. And may your spouse return your life savings untouched, though hopefully you won't have to wait 4 years to find out. This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening.